Hello and welcome to another video on post-processing, this time with Photoshop. Last time I worked with 5 images that were different exposures and merged them together into an HDR image in Photomatix Pro. And in this video, I'm going to edit that resulting HDR image in Photoshop. So let's see what I need to do with this. So first of all, what I'm going to need to do is remove some of these spots here, like the airplane I think that was an airplane. I'll need to remove that from the image. And this upper right corner I'm not really crazy about because there seems to be missing some color. It's a little bit grayer than I would have liked it to be. So I'm going to see if I can fix that. And along the edge of the lake here, there are a couple of people, actually more than a couple, but I'm going to see if I can clone them out so that they're not in the final image. Let's see if there's anything else along the shoreline that I want to get rid of. Well, there's this tree here that I don't like very much, so I think I'm going to clone that out as well. And then a couple of trees over here on the left side that I'm not really crazy about either. But I can clone those out, and I will show you kind of how I do that. So other things I might want to do with this image are to increase some of the contrast in the clouds and maybe increase the saturation as well. I have a little bit of pink showing up in the clouds and I want to maybe emphasize that a little bit. I'm not sure how much I want to do that though, but I'll go through that. And I may also want to make some adjustments to this rock here that's on the right side. A lot of times when I have a rock with a lot of texture, I like to increase that contrast in between the rocks, in the cracks in the rocks. And like if there's an overhanging area like this, I will increase the shadows there and maybe brighten up the front part of it so that it's a little bit more emphasized. And down there in the lower part, there's also another overhang that I want to change. And down here in the left corner, I've got some branches and twigs that I'm going to see if I can clone out also. Okay, so what else do I want to do with this image? Like I was saying, I want to adjust the contrast of the clouds a little bit and maybe a little bit of the saturation of the clouds. I'll definitely want to remove these dust spots from the image. These are things that are on the sensor of my camera that show up, but they can easily be removed with the spot healing brush or the clone tool. And just scroll around a little bit more and find any others that might be there. And so now I'm going to edit this in Photoshop. So I right click on the edit in and select edit in Photoshop CC. I don't want to make any adjustments to the image itself. I just want to make them in layers on top of that image. So that if I want to go back later and start over with my edits, I can do that. So I'm going to create a new layer so that I can get rid of these dust spots and other stuff. When I was recording the footage for this video, it ended up taking me about an hour totally to do this Photoshop edit. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to speed it up quite a bit. And I'm only going to give a high-level overview of each of these adjustments that I'm going to be making to the image. In future videos, I'm going to talk about these types of edits in a lot more detail, so I'm going to leave that out for now. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the clone and stamp tool to essentially copy parts of the image from one place to another so that I'm overwriting sections of the image that I am not wanting to keep. In this case, basically the people that were on the shoreline and some of the dead trees on the side. A lot of this is trial and error until I get a result that I'm happy with. And usually I will use multiple different source areas to copy from so that you can't see much duplication of parts of the image. Ordinarily, I don't do a whole lot of cloning and stamping in my images, but in this one I was doing quite a bit of it. And that is what took the majority of the time that I spent editing this image in Photoshop. In the process of removing the branches that were in the bottom corner, I made some obvious changes to the color of the water. And so in order to smooth that out, I'm going to take that clone and stamp tool, but then drop the opacity of it to 25% so that I can then blend the color of the water together so it looks more natural. So that's it for the cloning and stamping to remove unwanted objects. And the next thing I'm going to do is work on the saturation and contrast of the cloud area. And I do that in a different layer, this time with a curves adjustment. And for the contrast, I just make the dark parts darker and the bright parts brighter. And my adjustment's usually stronger than I want it to actually be. And the reason I do that is so that I can change the opacity of that adjustment layer so that I'm getting less or more of that effect. But I don't want this effect to take place on the entire image. I just want this to take place on the clouds and the reflection of the clouds in the water. And so what I end up doing is creating a mask that will only allow us to apply the adjustment to those areas where we want it. And with masks, white on the mask will reveal everything on that layer, and black will conceal everything on that layer and those particular pixels. And so what I want to do is have the cloud area and the reflection area be white and everything else be kind of black, and that's what I'm doing in this process right now. So that was how I handled the contrast in the clouds. The next thing I'm going to do is handle the saturation. And the first thing I tried to do was use a saturation adjustment, and I wasn't liking how that was turning out, so I will do something a little bit different in just a moment. Instead of the saturation adjustment, what I ended up doing was creating an overlay layer, and with that I'm going to be painting like a purplish color over it, and then I'm going to drop that opacity way down, but it will leave behind hints of that color. And I'm going to do a similar thing in the upper right hand corner where I'm trying to replace that grayish area with something with a little bit more color. And I'm not exactly sure why I did it in the first layer rather than in the overlay layer, but that's what I did. Now the next thing I decided to do was bring up the brightness of the trees because I didn't want them to be quite so dark. So I'm doing another curves adjustment. This time I'm bumping up the midtones and the shadows. And again, I'm going to use a mask so that only applies to the areas where I want that adjustment to take place. In this particular case, it's very convenient that I had the mask from the clouds because the inverse of that mask works perfectly for the foreground area or the tree area that I wanted to make that adjustment on. And next I decided to increase the contrast in parts of this rock, and for that I use another overlay layer, and I'm going to be painting black in the areas where I want it to be darkened, and I'm going to paint white where I want the areas to be lightened. And right now I have this adjustment turned all the way up so that it looks a little bit stronger than I really want it to be, but I'm doing that so that I can tell where I'm actually applying that adjustment. And then once I'm done with that, I'm going to reduce the opacity on that adjustment layer so that it's not quite so evident. The next thing I'm going to be doing is applying a manual vignetting effect so that I can darken certain parts of the image. In particular, I'm going to be darkening the corners of the image, and I'm going to be brightening up the middle of the image. With this overlay adjustment, it doesn't really darken the really bright spots very easily, so I'm going to be making another vignetting adjustment later on in Lightroom. And after all that, I discovered there was a dust spot up in the upper left corner that I apparently didn't remove earlier, so I can remove that now. And so at this point I think I'm done with my Photoshop edits. Here I'll just toggle the original TIFF image that I imported into Photoshop so that you can see where I started. And then I'm going to re-enable the different layers so that you can see what each one of them did. And then I can toggle the adjustment layers on and off so that you can see the before and after part. And now that I'm finished, I can save this image in Photoshop. When it is done, these changes will automatically show back up in Lightroom. And then back in Lightroom, we're going to have our edited image along with the 5 original exposures that we captured in the field. And here I'm just going to cycle through all of those so that you can see where we how we got to where we are now. And as I was saying before, there's that vignetting effect that I wanted to apply in Lightroom that will take care of the brighter parts of the vignette that didn't really get impacted by our edit in Photoshop. And now that I've done that, I'm looking over in the bottom left corner and noticing some artifacts of my cloning and stamping of that branch that was in that corner. And what I could do is fix that in Photoshop and then bring it back into Lightroom and then reapply that vignette, or I can do what I'm doing right here and just cropping out that corner. So here on the left, we've got one of our original exposures, and on the right, we've got the final edit. And that's basically an example of how I would go about post-processing an HDR image from the raw exposures all the way through merging those raw exposures into one HDR image with Photomatix Pro, and then after that, making adjustments to it in Photoshop. So that's it for this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. And in future videos, I will be covering individual adjustments that I will make in Photoshop.